Bad Brains took the punk movement and created something entirely their own out of it. They blended different musical styles and created this explosion of energy on the stage. I think they are easily one of the most important bands in the history of punk, so I'm super excited to bring you the story of the Bad Brains. Ever since my Minor Threat video, people have kept recommending I do a video on the Bad Brains, so hope you're still here to watch it. Don't forget to give the video a like if you end up enjoying it, and subscribe for more of these stories from music history. Paul Hudson was born in Liverpool in February of 1956. His father, Leon, was from Alabama and he joined the Air Force, so he moved around quite a lot. While he was stationed in the UK, Leon met HR's mother, Carmen, who was a nurse from Jamaica. A year later, when they were back in Alabama for a bit, Paul got a brother named Earl. When they were young, the family moved around quite a bit because the dad was in the Air Force. It's just kind of what you do, but they spent some time living in Jamaica. According to Paul, his mother told him that she would be leaving for a bit and he didn't want to go, so they just kind of left him and Earl there for a year. Paul said, quote, "I was about 3 years old and my mother dropped me and my brother off at my Auntie May's house in Kingston. My parents left and went on their way. They had to get some things together so my mom could go to the U.S." End quote. Also, fair warning, there's going to be a lot of quotes in this one, so if you don't like that, I don't know why you wouldn't like that, but if for some reason you don't, sorry. After that, the family moved to Hawaii, where Paul and Earl learned how to skateboard long before that was a super popular thing for people to be doing. And Paul learned how to make these waterboard things, and he kind of just fell in love with doing that. Paul also tried to swim to a boat that was a little bit farther than he originally thought and almost drowned before his dad had to jump in and save him. It was also in Hawaii that they first really started playing music. Earl used to play drums on these cardboard boxes that he had set up, and since they couldn't afford a guitar, Paul would play on this little ukulele. They even met two brothers named Jeff and Jimmy who knew how to play guitar, so they kind of formed this little band. They would practice all day, and then when their dad got home, he would sit down and say, "All right, come show me," and then they would bring all of their stuff out and play little songs for him. They mostly played simple little songs like the Batman theme song and "I Want to Hold Your Hand" by the Beatles. And then in 5th grade, Earl actually got a real drum set. They kept moving around, eventually settling in Alabama and Texas for a little bit, and that's where Paul first started playing football. He was a running back, and he was known as the Gnat because he was so quick and he could just dodge in between people. And that was the start of him being a really good athlete. They lived in New York for a while, where Paul started to swim, and his coach really wanted them to stay because he thought Paul had a shot to actually make it into the Olympics. The family moved out of New York and relocated to Washington, D.C. In D.C., Leon retired out of the Air Force and started working at Boeing as a mechanic. Paul said that he really struggled when they first got to D.C. because he was super introverted, and that was the first time he was living away from Army kids, so he didn't really know how to connect with people. He said, quote, "As a youngster, I was very withdrawn. I didn't talk to people at all." End quote. But eventually, as he got a little bit older, gained a little bit more confidence, and learned that he was a really good athlete, and that came with certain perks, he became quite a bit of a ladies' man. He started carrying this cane/staff thing around with him, and people jokingly called it the hunting rod because he was out hunting for girls. So that's how he first started going by the name HR. After school, HR started to feel kind of lost. He was dabbling in drugs, working at a security job, and contemplating going back to school to study pre-med, maybe going to law school. He just kind of really didn't know where he was going to go. And that was around the time that Earl introduced HR to Gary Miller. Earl said, quote, "Gary used to be in junior high school with me, and we used to be in the same classes. Gary was always in a band playing bass, and I introduced him to HR. We were always going to some of Gary's gigs and just hanging out or whatever." End quote. Gary started to teach AR how to play the guitar, and they became really focused on starting a band and trying to do this whole music thing. Gary Miller was born in 1958 in Washington, D.C. He started playing bass in high school because one of his friends already played the guitar. He said, quote, "I had a good friend of mine back in the day, and he played guitar already, so I started playing the bass," end quote. For his first bass, he converted an old guitar into a bass by just taking off two of the strings. Also, my cat's not just weirdly frozen down here. He just really wants to climb into my lap, but I'm not letting him do that right now. Gary was always super interested in music and was going to different concerts basically every weekend when he met HR. He was also working in a steakhouse, and he managed to get HR and some other friends a job there as well. But despite all of that, Gary never really planned on being a professional musician. He said, quote, "I was going to Maryland University and I wanted to be a doctor," end quote. So that's how people started calling him Dr. No, or just the Doc. Around the same time that HR met the Doc, he also met Daryl Jennifer. They were all just kind of in this big conglomerate group together. Daryl was born in D.C. in 1960 and was a longtime friend of Dr. No. As their childhood friend Alvarez Tolson explains it, they would all gather to play music, and they would just throw parties every Friday night and charge people 50 cents to get in and jam with them. By this point, Dr. No had switched over to guitar since he had always kind of preferred that, so HR was trying to play the bass, but HR wasn't really good at it. So at one of these parties when HR was trying and largely failing to play the bass, Alvarez knew that Daryl was somewhere out there, so he went out and tried to convince Daryl to get up on stage and play with him. But Daryl, for some reason, refused. But then the next day, Daryl called HR, and then the next thing you know, they're in a band together. So the four of them, HR, Earl, Daryl, and Dr. No/Gary, started to jam together and try and figure out what kind of sound they wanted to go for. They were really interested in and influenced by progressive jazz musicians like Stanley Clarke, and HR was particularly influenced by a funk group called Mandrill, but their own group, which they called Mind Power, hadn't landed on a sound yet. They hadn't even decided who was going to play what instrument. HR said, quote, "Gary and Daryl couldn't make up their minds what instruments to play. Sometimes Daryl would want to play the bass, so he gave his guitar to Gary, and Gary gave Daryl the bass," end quote. But word started to get around about Mind Power, and people started requesting that they play some parties, so they decided we really need to rehearse and figure out what we're going to do. And that kind of started a long trend of HR not wanting to put the band out there and put their music out there until he thought they had rehearsed enough to be perfect. The type of music that they loved, this progressive jazz, was really fast, so they really worked on playing their instruments proficiently as fast as they could. And that's something that they would then take into their punk career and make them stand apart from the rest of the hardcore punk bands. Daryl called what they were doing at that time basement fusion, just kids in a basement jamming. And it was around this time that HR was introduced to something that would completely change his life. The book Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. It's like a self-improvement book that was released in 1937, and HR discovered it by randomly pulling it off of his dad's bookshelf. Through that book, he discovered something that he called PMA, or positive mental attitude. HR describes it as, quote, "No matter what you've got to do in life, be positive. Keep a burning desire. Keep the truth going," end quote. He then decided to apply that PMA and other ideas from that book into his personal life, and it really changed and impacted the way he thought about things. Earl said, quote, "It was all about keeping a positive mental attitude. You have to focus on your plan and try not to differ from that. Be focused, and no other thing can interrupt that, or should interrupt that," end quote. So HR became super focused on his one thing, his music. But then Mind Power played one gig and by all accounts were terrible. That caused HR to kind of withdraw and start questioning if this was the path he wanted to focus on. And that's when Daryl introduced the band to a guy named Sid McRae. Sid said that when he met HR, he could tell that HR was looking for something, the same way that Sid was looking for something when he found punk rock music. He first saw punk on a random PBS documentary that showcased bands like the Sex Pistols. He saw the aggression and the passion of those bands, and it really energized him. So he told the Mind Power guys that they just had to hear this music too. Daryl said, quote, "Sid McRae came over to my house. He had safety pins and stuff all over him, and he had records. Ramones, Dead Boys, Generation X. I found to be kind of interesting. The cats couldn't really play, but they had something to say," end quote. HR remembered Sid playing the Sex Pistols record, and he was just really intrigued by the way they looked. And then Sid played them the Ramones album, and that's when the music really clicked for HR. A few weeks later, they got the chance to see the Ramones play in Maryland, and HR said, quote, "The singer didn't move around much, he just kind of stood there. But buddy, the audience was just jumping all around. I said, oh boy, look at this, I want this," end quote. Since Mind Power had kind of realized that their jazz fusion thing wasn't working, wasn't getting them anywhere, and they wanted a new direction, punk felt like a good path to explore. So they changed their name to Bad Brains, which was taken from a Ramones song, and asked Sid to be their vocalist. Dr. No said about switching to punk, quote, "We had something that we wanted to say, and with jazz fusion, we really couldn't express what we wanted to say. It was basically signs of the times, because these are hard times we're living in, you just have to yell out." End quote. But eventually, Sid's kind of destructive attitude wasn't really fitting with the PMA mindset that the rest of the band had. Sid said, quote, "I was still into my destructive thing. I still had to run that course. I sung with the band for a little while, but I fizzled out because I saw that HR was a much better singer." End quote. Sid also wasn't really into Bob Marley or the whole reggae thing, but Bob Marley quickly became one of the biggest influences for the rest of the group. After they saw Bob Marley perform, they got really interested in reggae and the whole Rastafarian movement. HR in particular said that his life was changed when he saw Bob Marley. So as well as their jazz fusion roots and their funk roots and now this new punk sound, they started to incorporate elements of reggae into that. Then they heard about the band The Clash, who also incorporated elements of reggae, not to the same extent Bad Brains did, but some elements of reggae, and the idea of community outreach into their music and their act, and that really inspired the Bad Brains. They got really inspired by a book called 1988 and decided to all change their names to kind of fit into the punk aesthetic. That's when Paul really leaned into the HR name, Gary leaned into the Dr. No name, and Daryl became Daryl Cyanide. I don't know if Earl had another name. He's just kind of always been Earl. I don't know. That's also when HR took over the singing duties for Sid. Dr. No described the kind of music they started to play as, quote, "We kind of musically open up and just break down the barriers. A bunch of black dudes playing crazy rock and roll that you rock and roll white people can't even play. Playing some funk and this and that, and then playing reggae too." End quote. They started to rehearse a ton. During the day, HR and Gary worked at a plant making bombs. Earl worked at an electrical company, and Daryl was in electronics school. So at night, they would all get together and rehearse basically every night until like 5 a.m. Earl said, quote, "We did that for like a year straight and then started playing some shows. The first show was at our house. We had some kids come through there, and it was pretty cool." End quote. After that first show and a couple other shows, their fame started to spread a little bit around the DC punk community. Ian Mackay of Minor Threat and Fugazi fame remembers seeing them at other punk shows around the area, just handing out flyers and promoting their band. And then they started to play basement parties in these small clubs. Right from the start, their shows were known for being super high energy, probably helped by the fact that they played their instruments so fast. And HR, as this like actually pretty gifted athlete, was doing backflips and jumping off the stage and all of this crazy stuff that people weren't used to seeing, even in the punk community at that time. While the group was exploding, at least in their small scene, HR slipped into that rock and roll lifestyle. He started to do more drugs and pick up more women. Skeeter Thompson from the band Scream said, quote, "He had this outlook like live fast and die young. He had a presence about him," end quote. But then HR started to hang out with these Rastafarian guys who would come see the band play at a little venue called Madam's Organ. Earl said that he and HR had grown up in church, so they always knew about Jesus and the Bible, but meeting these Rastafarian guys opened up new truths to them. HR in particular was really fascinated by it, and he started carrying a Bible around with him wherever he went. Meanwhile, the Bad Brains continued to dominate the DC punk scene. Their shows were unlike anything else people had ever seen. Ian Mackay said, quote, "For me, the Bad Brains around 1980 were the greatest band in the world, are still the greatest band in the world to me. They were just that good," end quote. Ian remembered seeing them for the first time and being just amazed that they were from the DC area because they were just light years above even the touring bands that would come through. They often talk about being banned in DC, and that's why they had to move to New York, but I'm not sure that's the most accurate statement. I'm sure some clubs probably refused to book them because their audiences could get a bit rowdy. But the story that I've seen that makes the most sense to me is that they decided to move out of DC because they realized they would never be able to make a living wage playing in the DC community. The market just wasn't there for that, especially playing the type of music that they were playing. They knew that if they wanted to be put in front of the right people, maybe get signed to a record label, or just make money playing shows, they needed to go to either New York or LA. Plus, Dave Vanian loved them, and he wanted to bring them to London to record. So they felt like they needed to go conquer New York as the next step, make enough money to go over to England, and then just kind of explode from there. But Dr. No kind of going on with the band in DC thing, said that there were basically only 3 clubs that they could play at, and all of the owners knew each other, so they all got together and just kind of decided to ban the Bad Brains from playing at those clubs because the audiences were too rowdy and they were inciting riots. The whole idea of them being banned in DC became a major part of their mythology, and they even have a song about it that I think is their most popular song on Spotify. So who am I to say they actually weren't? They probably were to some extent. They did eventually fly to England to record with Dave, but they were turned away at customs because customs found a little vial that they honestly probably correctly assumed was drug paraphernalia. So customs confiscated their passports and confiscated their instruments and then put them on a plane back to New York. Earl said, quote, "We were living in New York when we got back and we didn't have any money, living off of shows and a bag of chips a day." End quote. They started to play the normal punk circuit in New York, places like CBGB and Max's Kansas City. Dr. No said, quote, "We played CBs every friggin' night. This whole Sunday matinee thing is from us. When we first played, nobody was there. It's like, who are these people? And we're in their face, killing it. We got a weekend day, and by then a little buzz started happening." End quote. After a while of playing, much like it did in DC, their incredible live shows built a super dedicated audience. They played fast and technical, and HR was the most energetic and crazy frontman in the scene at that time. They incorporated funk and reggae and jazz, which is something that these teenage hardcore kids just had never seen before. And then they used Earl's tax return money to record their first single, Pay to Come. That single kind of swept through the community both in New York and in DC, and people were just amazed by it. Alec Mackay, Ian's brother, couldn't understand how Earl could play that fast. He thought there had to be some sort of trick in the production. After that, they met Mo Sussman, who was working at a restaurant in DC and wanted to be their manager. HR said, quote, "He was an honest person, but he didn't exactly want to make our ideals a priority." Mo was excited to work with the Bad Brains because he felt HR's power and thought that there was something really exciting there. He knew that there was something really special, both about HR as a frontman and just the band in general. But Mo wanted to turn them into rock and roll superstars and suggested that they might need to clean up their image a little bit in order to do that. But he quickly bumped up against another recurring theme of this band, the idea that HR would torpedo any possible deals that would get the band that next level of success. Mo sunk a ton of money into the band, getting them a rehearsal space, getting them instruments, getting them fed and clothed. But he'd have these long conversations with HR trying to convince him of the things they needed to do to take that next step. Mo thought they could be a big band. HR wasn't willing to do the things that Mo thought they needed to do in order to become that big band. So they parted ways. But at least Daryl and Gary wanted to be a big band. They wanted that major label deal and to play those bigger shows. So that started a little bit of tension within the group. Meanwhile, their shows kept gaining attention. HR said, quote, "When kids in the audience heard our group, they would kind of go snap, crackle, pop, and pandemonium would spread. I'm going up there and dancing all crazy, doing flips and cartwheels and diving off the stage into the audience," end quote. Ian Mackay speculated that they invented the term moshing, because there was a popular phrase within the Rasta movement in reggae music called mash it up. So Ian says that these kids in New York couldn't really understand what HR was saying when he called for them to mash it up, and they thought he was saying mosh it up. So this style of kind of crazy dancing became moshing. That's not confirmed. That's not this is the story of how moshing became what it is, but it's as good a theory as any other I've seen. In 1981, they played this really tiny venue called 171A Studios. Jerry Williams, the owner of that club, recorded one of their sets, and the band really liked the way it sounded, so they agreed to come back in and actually record a actual album there. Then they met Neil Cooper at CBGB, who told them about his idea to release cassettes of this really exciting and interesting music and start a label called Reach Out International Records to do that. So they released their first album, originally only on cassette, through Reach Out International Records on February 15th, 1982, and it's often called the ROIR tape. Much like their single did, the album kind of took the scene by storm. People who had seen them live said it was a really good encapsulation of what the band sounded like on stage, and their energy and their passion really came through the recordings. But Daryl said that the recording process was oftentimes really difficult. He said, quote, "None of this stuff is like, let's go do this and be that. It's just like HR pushing things this away and that away. It was kind of labor intensive to be in Bad Brains at times, emotionally and physically." End quote. And then after looking around a little bit, they finally found the right manager for them in a guy named Anthony County. He was a student/punk fan who had gone to see them play and just kind of like fell into the job of managing them. He said that he had no interest at that time in being a band manager, but the band was looking for someone to help out, so he just kind of stepped into it. Anthony quickly got them on a tour, their first tour of the US, at least as far as I can tell, and things didn't go all that great. At this point, they were into the super hardcore Rasta religious movement, and HR gave an interview with Flipside magazine full of pretty viciously homophobic comments. Then they played a show with a band called the Big Boys in Texas, and Biscuit, who is the lead singer of the Big Boys, was gay, so HR called him some pretty horrible things, and then there's like this story about how they ripped off the Big Boys. Ian MacKaye kind of blames the people who were hanging around the Bad Brains at that point for some of this more erratic behavior. He said, quote, "I didn't always feel safe around those guys. They weren't interested in being friends with me as much as they were interested in what I could provide, perhaps," end quote. John Stabb said, quote, "It was hypocritical for HR to be doing those things. He would hang out and talk to us punk rock kids in his normal tone, and then he would totally change over to the Rastafarian thing with his Rasta friends, and he would just dismiss us," end quote. I am going to just take a second here to just point out that I'm not going to just blanket blame Rasta for the things that HR said and did. I don't know enough about the belief system to feel comfortable commenting on it in any real way, but I think it's pretty clear that there are Rastas who are super welcoming and super accepting. I also think it's pretty clear that HR was battling some other inner demons at this point that probably had more to do with his behavior than the Rastafarian belief system. For his part, HR does say now that he regrets those things. He said, quote, "Today I am much more live and let live. I would not say those things today. I think age and experience changed me." End quote. It was also on that tour that HR first started to announce to different crowds and magazines that he had fallen out of love with the punk community and was not a fan of punk music anymore. He wanted to play only reggae, and he even called punk the devil's music. But somewhere in there, Rick Ocasek saw them play and absolutely loved them. Rick convinced them to come to Boston and record an album with him that became the album Rock for Light. It did repeat several songs from their earlier cassette. Kind of around the time of that recording, HR started to get super paranoid, especially about Anthony, and thinking that he was hiding this money from him that HR thought he deserved. But Anthony pointed out that they didn't even have a record deal, so this money that HR thought was there never existed. He also drifted more firmly into his belief that punk was the devil's music, and he wanted to focus on reggae, which he thought was more akin to gospel music. It came to a head in 1983 when Tom Zutaut from Elektra Records was really impressed with them and wanted to sign them. But in the initial meeting, HR sort of threatened to kill him, and then he introduced Tom to Daryl by saying, "Daryl, I'd like you to meet Satan." So naturally, that kind of cooled Tom off on the whole deal. Another instance of HR torpedoing any chance for the band to move forward in terms of popularity and success. And after that, HR left the group to focus exclusively on reggae. HR and Earl moved back to D.C. to start the HR band, or the Human Rights Band. At some point, he had decided that, as well as Hunting Rod, HR also stood for human rights. So it's the HR band, Human Rights Band, which was reggae music, but there were still subtle influences of rock and punk in there. Then he also started another group called Zion Train, which was just strict reggae. He also started a record label called Olive Tree Records. But then he got arrested for selling weed on his son Paul Jr.'s, or PJ's, birthday. In 1985, the band got back together, and it was surprisingly easy to do. Anthony, their manager, said, quote, "It wound up being just a matter of a couple of phone calls. They got together, rehearsed, and basically that rehearsal turned into writing the record Eye Against Eye," end quote. For that album, they worked with the producer Ron St. Germain. Ron was a pretty big-time producer. He had just finished working on an album by Arcadia, which was like a Duran Duran offshoot that had a budget of $1.2 million. But SST Records, which was the only label they could find that was really interested in putting out a new Bad Brains album, only gave Ron $5,000 for the Bad Brains album. They recorded it mostly live, except for HR's vocals on Sacred Love, which he did over the phone while he was in prison for, once again, selling weed. People saw Eye Against Eye as a little bit of a departure for the band. It was a bit slower and more rhythmic than their typical hardcore punk sound, and just personally, I think it's their best album. That's a very subjective opinion. You're free to disagree with me on it. But I feel like it's the best representation of all of the different styles and sounds they were trying to merge, and I think the production on it is top-notch. I love that album. If you tried to get into Bad Brains and maybe you're not the biggest hardcore punk fan and you couldn't really get into their earlier albums, try this album, and if you still don't like it, then it's possible Bad Brains just isn't for you, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think this album is at least worth a listen. After Eye Against Eye came out, HR started to slip further and further out of control. He started to say more not great things that were sexist and homophobic. He started to get a little bit more violent at times, and then in 1987, after torpedoing yet another major label deal, he once again left the band to focus on the Human Rights Band and Zion Train. Daryl and the Doc tried to keep Bad Brains going with a new singer, but Ron St. Germain was convinced that it just wouldn't work without HR. Earl said, quote, "Without HR, there is no Bad Brains, because we built a solid rock where the fans only want to see the original band," end quote. They were working on a new album when Ron St. Germain suggested that it wasn't working without HR, so they did manage to convince HR to come back into the studio to record the vocals for this new album, which became Quickness, released in 1989. It's an album that features a very controversial, potentially homophobic song called Don't Blow Bubbles. Originally, they claimed it wasn't about homosexuality, but in 2016, HR confirmed that it was, and then he kind of apologized for it and said that he wouldn't ever write something like that today. So with HR back in the band, things did not stabilize. They went on a tour of Europe and he got into a massive fight with Daryl in Germany. He was incredibly unpredictable, so once again HR left the group. This time the band didn't want to wait for him, so they released an album with a new singer in 1993. That singer was Israel Joseph. Israel came from a reggae band and auditioned for Bad Brains in New York. Daryl specifically called him and asked him to audition, which Israel didn't believe at first. He thought it was someone playing a joke on him. When he sang the songs that HR originally wrote, he tried to mimic HR's voice, even though his normal singing didn't actually sound like HR. He said, quote, "These are Joe's songs, so I'm not going to sing them like me. I'm going to sing them like him. I'm going to pay homage to the Rasta man," end quote. I don't know that I mentioned this, but HR was also going by Joseph at this point, so that's what he means by saying they were Joe's songs. Meanwhile, HR moved out to California and was really struggling. He connected with some bands out there that were really inspired by the Bad Brains, people like POD and Sublime, so he got to play a little bit with them, but mostly he was just kind of homeless and drifting around. He was really struggling with his mental health at this point. People he was playing with describe him having hallucinations and intense paranoia, and I'm not a mental health expert or professional in any way, but I think it can be reasonably said that it sounds like he was dealing with a lot of schizophrenic episodes. But then the Bad Brains are offered another major label deal, this time with Madonna's label called Maverick, and HR actually signs this one. So in 1995, he's back with the group. They released their sixth album in 1995 called God of Love, which leaned more reggae than punk, and they once again called on Rick to produce it. According to Rick, HR was not in the best place while they were working on this album. He said, quote, "HR was doing some crazy stuff. He was visiting the label on a daily basis and bringing them dead fish, and all kinds of weird things were going on," end quote. I think this was also the time that HR demanded that his current girlfriend be handcuffed to him at all times. But to give Maverick credit, they really tried to promote this new album. They even got the single some airplay on MTV, and they got Bad Brains a spot opening for the Beastie Boys, which turned out to be a disaster. HR was incredibly mentally unwell at this point and didn't even make it onto the stage for their first show. He then locked himself in his bus, and when they tried to get him out, he attacked Earl and Anthony. They tried to keep going, but at a show in Kansas, HR once again got a little bit violent. He hit someone in the crowd in the face with a mic stand. At the time, they claimed that HR hit him because the guy in the crowd, who I've seen called a skinhead, but I don't know if that's true. But they said that guy was spitting on HR, and HR really didn't like that. HR later said that he saw the guy have a gun. HR said, quote, "I saw a pistol, and I took the microphone stand, and I went up, and I came down, and I hit the person in the head. I don't know if it was the one who had the gun or what, but I knew I had to get off that stage. I don't even know to this day if they really did have a gun pointed at Daryl or not, but I didn't want to take any chances." I've also seen Anthony say that HR saw this guy beating up his girlfriend and he wanted to put a stop to it, but whatever the actual reason, HR gets arrested again and the band breaks up again and they lose that deal with Maverick Records. Starting in 1998, they did spend a few years touring together again under Soul Brains because HR didn't want to be associated with bad in any way, and they released a couple live albums during that time. Since then, they've released 3 more albums, the last one in 2012, and struggled through some more really dark days with HR. But in 2012, HR married Lori Carnes, who finally convinced him to go see a doctor, specifically about these excruciating headaches he was having. They were able to diagnose him with the somewhat rare syndrome, and he went through brain surgery to kind of alleviate some of those headaches. It worked, and HR said that he didn't realize how badly those headaches were impacting him until they were gone. Lori also convinced him to seek mental health treatment, and that doctor was able to get him on some medication that appears to be really helping him. Lori said when they first got married, she rarely saw the real HR. It was maybe like once a month that he seemed clear and not in pain from the headaches. But now he's there more often than not. So that's a really good sign. I'm really happy to hear that. I hope it's still the case. I normally like to conclude these videos by kind of giving like a retrospective and saying how influential and important the band was, but I don't know that I really need to do that here. I think if you've made it to this point in the video, you understand just how important and influential and impactful the Bad Brains were. So just gonna end it here. That was the story of the Bad Brains. Remember to give the video a like if you did enjoy it. Leave a comment below with anything you think I missed out on, anything that needs to be covered in a little bit more in depth. And also leave a comment with like your favorite Bad Brains memories and stories. I always love reading those types of comments. I always love seeing how the band impacted and influenced people. I think that's really cool. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories from music history.